English period. Let us first see what is meant by the usage of the term. In English language and literature, the period that extends from 1066, the year of the Norman conquest, to 1500 is designated as the Middle English period. This age marks a clear break from the Old English period, also called the Anglo-Saxon period, and was prominent during the Plantagenet era. From about 1500, the dialect called Chancery Standard began to be widespread in England. The Norman conquest is an important event in the history of England because it was the time when the French ruled over England, and the French influence on every aspect of English life became notable. The conquest happened when William, the Duke of Normandy, won in the Battle of Hastings in 1066 in a dynastic war for the throne of England. As a result of the war, King William became William I of England, and his Norman countrymen became feudal lords in England. Of course, Norman French was spoken in the English court from 1042 onwards. In fact, English and Norman French were both common languages in England. However, Norman French enjoyed the patronage of the court, the nobility, and the law courts. Even French literature was more popular among the upper classes, and French was the upper class language or the prestige language, while English was relegated to the common class. Anglo-Saxon and Norman French mingled to form what is now called Middle English. This is the mixed Anglo-French tongue from which modern English has descended. French influence on English was present for a century after the Norman invasion ended till about 1204. The process of mingling was complete by about the year 1300. It was only in 1362 that English replaced French as the language of the law courts. Another important characteristic of the Middle English period is the huge number of dialects in English. The reason for the large number of dialects is that, as noted earlier, Norman French was the predominant upper class language, and English language tried to develop with the help of dialects such as West Saxon and East Midland. However, when William Caxton, towards the end of the Middle English period, introduced the printing press in England, he printed his earliest books in East Midland dialect. Hence, East Midland dialect became the standard dialect of England. Important texts that document the change from Old English to Middle English are the Ormulum, the Arcane Wes, and Catherine Group and Ironbite of Inwit. The changes in the language affected in this period were in terms of grammar, spelling, pronunciation, and vocabulary. The Middle English period witnessed birth and flourishing of various genres in English literature. Latin was the official language, and the most popular genre of literature in Latin was the Chronicle. Geoffrey of Monmouth's Historia Regum Britanniae contained accounts of Gorboduc, Lear, and Cymbeline, and provided material for various later writers, including William Shakespeare. Historia Regum Britanniae was translated into English by Layman as Brutt. Other prominent chronicle writers were Lawrence of Durham and William Newburgh, who is considered as the father of historical criticism. The first translation of Euclid also belongs to this period and was made in this period by Adelard. Homilies, commentaries that follow the reading of a scripture, were another important literary form. These were written by mendicant friars. Poema Morale was the first homily, followed by Ormulum by Orm. Richard Rolle was another prominent homily writer. Religious poetry was famous, just as it was in the Old English period. There was a special form called macaronic poems, a mixture of Latin and English words. Religious instruction was popularized by Cursor Mundi. There were a lot of writings about saints too, prominently about Saint Catherine and Saint Julian. Another important development in this period was the translation of the Latin Bible to English by John Wycliffe, which enabled more number of people to read the Bible. The first debate in English was written in this period, Owl and the Nightingale. Ancren Revell was a guidebook for nuns. Robert Manning's Handling of Zen was also written during this period. The first lyrics were also written in the 12th century. Summa is Ecumen in is the first English lyric written in 1240, after Geoffrey Chaucer had translated Guillaume de Loris, Roman de la Rose into English. Writing of allegorical poetry became popular. A peculiar form of literature called the bestiary flourished in this period. These are stories that are in the form of allegories, and animals' physical characteristics are given moral explanations. The earliest works of this kind are Bernard Silvestris' Cosmographia and Alanus ab Insulis' Plaint of Nature. The most famous work in this period of this kind is William Langland's Piers Plowman. The fableau, a crude, humorous and realistic form of poetry, seen as a revolt against tradition, was first written in English in this period. The fable or moral story was another genre that was popular in the Middle Ages. The Middle English period also witnessed a shift from heroic to romantic poetry. There are two reasons for this. One was the relative period of stability in England, which enabled the writing of romances compared to the earlier period of war and strife, which resulted in heroic poetry. The other reason for the shift was the influence of French literature. The sources for these romances were French, Roman and English literature. The French romances were usually about Charlemagne and knights and about the Crusades. The Roman romances dealt with stories about Troy. The romances originated from Britain, however, were usually about the adventures of King Arthur and his knights. Ballads, narrative rhythmic poetry, were popular during this period. Although ballads were orally transmitted even in the Old English period, the first written records were found only in the Middle English period. The Robin Hood ballads were written in the 14th century. We can thus see that an incredible amount of literature was produced in this period. Along with the birth and development of literary genre, there were major changes in grammar as well in this period. The main aim of these changes was an attempt at simplifying the language. Thus, there was an attempt to level the vowels of final unaccented inflectional syllables. A greater degree of uniformity was thus achieved. With its simplified case ending system, the grammar of Middle English is much closer to that of modern English than that of Old English. In Middle English, only two distinct noun ending patterns from the complex system of inflection in Old English are retained. The early modern English words angle and name demonstrate these two patterns. Some nouns of the angle type have an E in the nominative or accusative singular, like the weak declension, but otherwise have strong endings. The strong en in plural form has not ended with Middle English, but survived into modern English. The weak en form is now rarely found in the standard language, used only in words such as oxen, children, brethren, and it is slightly less rare in some dialects, used in iron for eyes, shoon for shoes, hosen for hose, kine for cows, and bean for bee. Another important feature of Middle English grammar is the attempt to reduce the ending of words, or more commonly called the leveling of inflections. This process was rapid in some areas like the north, where the change had begun even before the end of Old English, and in the East Midlands. In a few stereotyped phrases, inflectional forms lingered into the modern period, but overall English lost its inflections in the Middle English period. By Shakespeare's time, the process of the leveling of inflections was complete. A consequence of the leveling of inflections that had a far-reaching effect on English grammar was the substitution of neuter gender for grammatical gender. Neuter gender is the classification of gender not based on any formal principle, but is based on the gender of the noun, pronoun, or adjective. In gender, inanimate objects have common gender. The reasons for this substitution were many. One of them was that the common people who spoke English in the period between 1066 and 1200 found it difficult to master the complicated grammar related to gender. Also, the same object which was masculine in English is feminine in French, or vice versa. The only way out of this confusion was to adopt a neuter gender, which was done. The loss of inflections in the adjectives was also another reason for the shift to neuter gender. In order to simplify the English language, the changes in gender were necessary. Changes in grammar were not restricted to inflectional changes. Pronouns too were affected. For instance, personal pronoun she was introduced in the middle of the 12th century. The Middle English period thus marks an important epoch in the grammar of the English language. The most important development in pronunciation took place in the region of Midland. The long A as in ham became the long O as in home. Another significant development was the lengthening of the short vowels in open syllables and the shortening of long vowels in closed syllables. Another change that was affected was in the case of long vowels. Ford changed to food and born changed to boon. In certain words by metathesis, an R or an S changed its position. For example, lips changed to lisp and bread changed to bird. The unstressed E was often not pronounced at the end of verse lines, or if the following line began with a vowel or H. Also, the final E, whether pronounced or not in Middle English, indicates a long vowel in modern English. Changes in spelling were orthographical. For example, the hard vowel gave way to the letter K, as in sinning and king. When French words were introduced into English, endless confusion in pronunciation occurred, and some regular and uniform system was necessitated. As a result of this, S was pronounced hard before a back vowel and soft before a front vowel. So, in Old English, the words cumin, come, and service, church, has approximately the sound K, although one was guttural and the other was palatal. By the end of the period, the front S in service sounded like sibilant consonant, much like the modern ch. As the French scribes used the sound ch in their own language, the convention of using the letters ch for these sibilant consonants developed in Middle English. Again, Old English E had the sound of E, and this sound remained in some dialects, but the French scribes wrote it as oo, like in French. Therefore, words like church used oo, but the usual spelling of the sound oo, as in Old English whose, and short oo, as in lufu, were both represented by oo. So, French scribes made oo represent three distinct English sounds: E, oo, and oo. Thus, the long oo changed to ow. For example, whose became changed to house. Even before the Norman conquest, there were influences of French on English. But the Norman conquest and the ensuing inflow of French nobility ensured that many French words got into English. So, the French influence on the English vocabulary was most widespread during the Middle English period. During this period, over 10,000 French words were adapted into the English language and are still in use. Words such as castle and baron were derived from the feudal and monarchical system from the time of William the Conqueror. The word villain meant a villager. Perceiving their behavior as coarse and harsh, the nobles considered them as bad people. Thus, villain became villain, an undesirable character, and later came to be an evil person. The judicial system of the time gave rise to words such as prison and court. The names of most crimes, including that of cheat, were first used in English in the Middle English period. The influence of the medieval church led to words like parson, charity, and beauty, which came from medieval scholarship and learning. Charity originally meant love, but it gradually changed meaning to mean help given to the poor. The words jeweler and carpenter came into English from French, as the latter practiced these trades more often than the Englishmen. Similarly, other words came from the developments in other fields. While physics came from science, influence came from astrology, as in the sense of the influence of the planets and stars. The existence of two languages simultaneously gave rise to synonyms which gradually became differentiated in meaning or usage. A prominent example is the pair of words wed and marry. The former word is the native word and originally meant to give a pledge, but not necessarily in terms of marriage. The latter is the French term and means to become a husband. In modern English, both mean roughly the same, although marriage has a more stilted and proper suggestion than wedding. For instance, child and infant, kingly and royal, etc. In this period, different names were used for animals and their meat. This was because French cooks used French names for the cooked meat. Example, cow, beef, sheep, mutton. Surnames began to be first used in this period. Surnames such as Cook and Sidebottom, indicating occupation or personal features, were initially only nicknames. These nicknames were necessary to distinguish people. Another manner of giving a distinct identity to people is by referring to parentage. Example, a person would be called Peterson, suggesting that he was born the son of Peter. With the passing of time, these nicknames were used as surnames to indicate heredity, and they were used as part of the name. The influence of Norman French can be gauged from the language of a chronicle written by a monk of the monastery of Peterborough in about 1155 on the reign of King Stephen. The writer is English, using his native idiom, yet we find French terms like accordant, to come to agreement, bataille, court, court, and pace, which means peace. Although these extensive changes were important for the development of the English language, there were disadvantages as well. The loss of native words, the different Middle English dialects, and the need of a standard English are some of the obvious disadvantages due to the influence of the French on English. We have already noted that the Norman conquest was an important influence in changes in vocabulary. The influence of other languages was also important. In the Middle English period, Latin was the language used for official purposes. Words in the field of technical knowledge, science, and church were taken directly from Latin. Some of them have passed into far wider use and are now very specific English words. Pauper, proviso, equivalent, legitimate are words from the law courts. Index, scribe, simile come from science and the schools. Requiem, collect, diocese, and mediator come from the church. The trend in the 15th century of translating from Latin led to further additions to English. The influence of Latin on English is therefore mostly lexical. The influence of Greek on English vocabulary is also great. Academy, atom, Bible, diphthong, harmony, ecstasy, nymph, tragedy, tyrant, and theatre are all of Greek origin. Just like the Norman conquest, another important event that gave a large number of words to the English was the Crusades. The contact with the East that happened because of the Crusades gave a few words to the English language. These words started appearing in the middle of the 13th century. One of them is the word assassin. This word was reportedly applied originally to an Oriental band of political murderers who poisoned their chosen victims with a kind of poison known as hashish. The words algebra, scarlet, azure, and orange are also of Arabic origin. In this period, a game of chance was invented by soldiers while waiting for the surrender of the Hasnat fortress. This game was named hazard. Hazard now means a risk. There were also many derogatory terms used with reference to the Muslims, whom the Englishmen hated. Mahound came from Mohammed, a standard term for the Antichrist. Other similar terms were infidel and miscreant, which, though French terms, took on more condemnatory coloring when applied to a Turk. The Scandinavian influence on English in reality began in the Old English period. However, as written records are only found in the Middle English period, the words of Scandinavian origin are first recorded in this period. Gape, ill, skill, wing, want, ransack, bathe, sky, troll, and other words are Scandinavian in origin. The association of England with Holland on the naval front led to Dutch words such as skipper, deck, hoist, bulwark, and marline being used in English. Also, the association with Holland with regard to civil engineering gave rise to words such as dam and polder. The trade that flourished the most during this period was the cloth trade. This was a reason for the addition of a few words that denoted cloth. But these cloths were named after the place of their origin. For instance, damask from Damascus, muslin from Mosul, and so on.